Do you ever feel like your ADHD symptoms swing wildly from week to week? Or that some points in your monthly cycle you get super emotionally dysregulated or can't executive function at all? Today we're going to look at the cutting edge research in the world of ADHD and periods. Hello and welcome to Through the Noise Coaching. My name is Lee and I'm a leadership coach specialising in growing the careers of mid to senior neurospices. And today's topic is a little bit outside of the realm of what I usually talk about. However, as a coach of neurospices, I know that we can't just compartmentalise ourselves into who we are at work and who we are outside of work. And in fact, studies have shown that what's going on outside of work really affects what's going on inside work as well. So we can't just split the two apart. And because I coach a number of people who are assigned female at birth, this is super important to their lives, and so today we're going to go into this topic. This area is woefully under-researched at the moment, along with a lot of ADHD in women. So actually today, research has only been coming out in the last year or so, so the papers we're looking at are fresh and come from this year, so super cutting edge stuff here. Before I do get into this though, I need to start with a little bit of housekeeping. I'm going to make references here in this video to depression, to eating disorders and to suicide. I'm not going to go into any of them in any great detail. I'm not going to share stories about them. What I am going to state is correlations between them and various different aspects. But I wanted to warn people about this because I don't want to be the cause of triggering anyone's trauma. I also want to make a point around language because much of the research done in the menstrual cycle has been done on women and girls almost exclusively. It doesn't include non-binary people, it doesn't include trans-masc people who are assigned female at birth, and so while both the paper and myself are going to try and use as inclusive language as possible to cover as many people that menstruate as possible, the research just doesn't really support that so far, and we don't know how hormones that someone might be taking might interact with their regular hormones due to their monthly cycle. Finally, I am a mathematician by education, not a biologist, and while I've done my best to translate things into plain English in this paper, I may have got something wrong, and so if I have misspoken about something, please leave me a comment. I'm not going to feel bad about being corrected for this. This is outside of my realm of expertise, but I'm trying my best here to be informative, and I will link the paper so you can go look at that yourself as well. With that out of the way, let's get into the meat of the video. The place I want to start is with the fact that women have historically been underdiagnosed with ADHD, and this is particularly pertinent during childhood, where representations need to be about 3 boys get diagnosed with ADHD for every 1 girl. This actually tends to even out during puberty, and by the time it gets to adulthood, it's about 1 to 1, which makes it a bit ridiculous that this research is only just being done now. In fact, many girls and young women with ADHD recognise that stereotypes around ADHD actually stop them getting diagnosed, with teachers and clinicians just not really believing that their symptoms were severe enough to warrant an ADHD diagnosis. This was something that I actually relate to a lot because the first person who spotted my ADHD was a friend who did have ADHD when I was 28 years old and asked me, "Do you have ADHD?" To which I was like, no, I don't have ADHD, but then that set in motion the whole research phase and being asked that question repeatedly that eventually led to my ADHD diagnosis. So as a result of this underdiagnosis of women, research around how ADHD presents in women and how ADHD affects women and people who are assigned female at birth, it's just not really there at all. This very much applies to the topic of today and the menstrual cycle. And in fact, the main paper that I'm using as a reference here was published in February 2024. I'm also using a second paper as a reference. It's actually pre-publication at the time of filming this video, although I was still able to access it and it will be out by the time this video comes out, so I will leave a link to it in the description. We'll start briefly with this pre-published paper. It's called Perceived Associations Between the Menstrual Cycle and Attention Deficit Hyperactive Disorder, ADHD, a qualitative interview study exploring lived experience. And the reason why we start with this is because it actually interviewed real people who were assigned female at birth to get their real lived experience. And I always appreciate a paper that looks at our lived experience. Well, I'm not going to go into detail in all the findings of this paper. I do want to pull out one, which said that participants found that their ADHD symptoms were more severe and their medication actually worked less well during their mid-luteal phase. So that's the middle of the luteal phase between day approximately 14 and 28 of the cycle. They found that their main symptoms were heightened executive dysfunction, emotional dysregulation, attention dysregulation, so they couldn't focus, their emotions were much harder to control, and executive function kind of went out the window. This sounds familiar. The The paper makes the point that, to their knowledge, no research on this topic exists before a 2023 paper. And the lead author of the 2023 paper is actually the author that we're going to look at in this paper from Feb 2024. So this paper is Attention Deficit Hyperactive Disorder and the Menstrual Cycle, Theory and Evidence. This paper starts by recognising that sex differences in ADHD is one of the most understudied areas in ADHD, which is why we see things like girls and women not getting diagnosed until much later, and why there are pervasive myths that women tend to present with more inattentive ADHD, when in reality combined ADHD is the most common for all genders. So I did mention earlier the gender differences in diagnoses in childhood, with 3 boys diagnosed for every 1 girl, and you might think that that's because there are more boys with diagnosis, but adults are now 1-to-1, and actually that ramp up seems to be seen during puberty, which leaves precedence to the suggestion that maybe hormones and our monthly cycle have something to do with it. This paper also makes an interesting point that I've not come across before, so I'm going to read you a quote. Girls and women with ADHD become more impaired and exhibit higher rates of comorbidity than boys and men, beginning during adolescence and persisting into adulthood. In particular, girls with ADHD are at a greater risk of suicide, affective disorders, binge drinking, substance use, and risky sexual behaviour. And all of these things tend to increase during puberty, especially for girls, which tends to suggest that hormones may be involved. When we talk about both hormones and life stages in which someone assigned female at birth may struggle with their ADHD more, we need to look at 3 particular life stages. Those are puberty, pregnancy, and the menopause. Puberty is one of these 3 that is most studied. In this time period, girls tend to experience more low self-esteem, social pressures, sexuality confusion, and decreased expectations of maturity, including a focus on body image. It's also when things like depression, anxiety, conduct problems, and substance use all tend to start to increase. These teen years correspond to dramatic rises in reproductive hormones, and in the only paper to have actually looked at this already, Aging and Pubertal Development differentially predicts symptoms of ADHD, depression, and impairment in children and adolescents, an 8-year longitudinal study. They found that there was an increase in impairment and depressive symptoms and a decrease in hyperactive symptoms in girls of this age group. There's even less study to do with pregnancy and menopause. We're aware of the concept of baby brain, which has been studied and shows some cognitive similarities between ADHD, but an actual relationship between pregnancy and ADHD hasn't been studied at all. I see a lot of conversations about ADHD and menopause in the spaces that I move in, but again, this relationship hasn't studied at all. There are signs to suggest that maybe there's cognitive difficulties that happen around menopause, but again, there's no real research to confirm or deny this either way. This paper makes a point that this is particularly egregious because people with ADHD are already suffering with difficulties with cognitive functioning, and so why aren't we investigating this double whammy? In fact, most of the research out there around hormones and cognition and mood in general is done explicitly on people without ADHD, not people with ADHD. Now, when it comes to sensitivity to hormones, some people are more sensitive to hormones than others, but actually they found that people who have ADHD tend to be much more on the more sensitive to hormone side than people that don't have it. So even more reason to not exclude this from the research. There is a long established theory developed in 1959 that says that hormones tend to be one of either organizational or activational. The basic idea is that sex hormones tend to either have an organizational effect on the brain, so something that occurs in early development and is permanent, or it's more transient and less long lasting, which is more activational. The activational ones can also occur throughout life. For people assigned male at birth, prenatal testosterone is actually thought to be important in the development of ADHD, and in this case it's organizational because it happens early on in development and it's a permanent change in the brain. Whereas for people assigned female at the birth, the menstrual cycle is more transient, and so the hormones there have a much more activational effect. On a side note, I hadn't heard of this organizational or activational theory before I started doing research for this video, so I did read up on it a little bit. It's not perfect. There have been studies that show that it's not always possible to split hormones into one of those 2 categories, and especially with sex hormones there may be some chromosomal impact in there as well. But it's something that is being actively researched and a work in progress, and it doesn't seem to be a problem to simplify down to this theory for this particular topic. So with this theory in mind, this means that we can consider menstruation as a key activating hormonal event. So now may be a good time to discuss some of the language used around the menstrual cycle and periods, because I'll be honest, a lot of the words kind of sound the same, and I lose track on this, even though it is really important. So I'm going to break it down as a reminder as much for my benefit as it is for your benefit. So there are 4 phases of the menstrual cycle. The first is menstruation, which we more colloquially know as a period, and that happens at the very start of the follicular phase. And the follicular phase starts from the first day of the period and lasts around about 14 days. It lasts until ovulation, which is the next stage, and that's when an egg is released. Post-ovulation, we move into the luteal phase, which continues up until we go back around into menstruation again. This paper also uses the term perimenstrual, which is around the menstruation period, and that's when the PMS symptoms start to happen. Now, the P in PMS actually stands for premenstrual, which is before the period, but it's actually not quite accurate naming because the symptoms do overlap a few days, so perimenstrual actually makes a lot more sense. And today I learned something new. So with this in mind, there is already existing research on other forms of psychopathology, so not ADHD, but things like depression and eating disorders are well researched in this space. The research suggests that there is a greater increase in depressive symptoms or suicide attempts in the late luteal or menstruation phase. And they think this might be caused by either a delayed response to the hormone surge during ovulation or the hormones dropping away immediately before menstruation. There's also some limited but conflicting information around drinking and risk-taking in that kind of mid-cycle phase. So using the theory we've spoken about so far, this paper suggests a multi-hormone sensitivity theory that basically says that in different stages of a cycle, then ADHD is going to be sensitive in different ways. They suggest 3 sensitivities. Number 1 is increases in hypersensitivity in the luteal phase, which causes irritability, interpersonal reactivity, anger and anxiety, and sensory sensitivities, which is driven by fluctuation in progesterone. Number 2, in the perimenstrual phase, there are decreases in cognitive function, but increases in depression, a lack of enjoyment in life experiences, anxiety and suicidality. This is driven by estradiol withdrawal. Number 3 is increases in reward-seeking behaviour such as maladaptive substance use and proactive aggression around ovulation, driven by a sudden increase in estradiol. Estradiol, by the way, is the most common form of estrogen found in people assigned female at birth. It also has impacts on learning and memory, fine motor control, pain perception and mood. So these 3 sensitivities can interact with people's physiology, personality, environmental factors, which is going to mean that everyone presents a little bit differently, much like they do with ADHD. Applying this now to ADHD, estrogen withdrawal in around the perimenstrual phase has impacts on executive function, emotional dysregulation, and our inability to focus. They suggest 2 ways that this withdrawal affects our dopamine. The first is that altered dopamine functioning in the prefrontal cortex causes temporary impairments in executive functions and downstream impairments in effective regulation of emotional behaviour. Number 2, reduced dopamine function in the mesolimbic regions, which results in all-toward reward responsivity and increases in anhedonia. That's the thing that means we don't enjoy life so much, and I have no idea if I pronounced that correctly. This can also lead to other changes in the menstrual cycle, such as an increase in risk-taking behaviour around that mid-cycle time period. In fact, they found that declines in estradiol actually predicted a 2-fold increase in severity of ADHD symptoms, particularly for people who are more impulsive. It also affects hyperactivity, impulsivity, and inattention differently. Hyperactivity, impulsivity tended to be affected by withdrawals in estrogen, regardless of what progesterone levels were, so kind of mid-cycle. Effects on inattention were actually driven by estrogen withdrawal as well, but were moderated by higher progesterone, which means that at the end of the cycle, when both hormones drop, we tend to see more of those inattentive symptoms. So to make this super clear, here's what happens. At the start of the period, both estrogen and progesterone are low, so we're more likely to experience, well, everything bad. That's executive function challenges, that's emotional dysregulation, that's struggling to pay attention to things, and there's also sensory sensitivities as well. After this, estrogen tends to rise again until we get to ovulation, where there's increased reward sensitivity, which on the negative side could lead to things like substance abuse and risk-taking. After ovulation, estrogen drops, but progesterone remains high, which mitigates some of the negative inattention effects. This continues until we get towards the end of the cycle, where the whole thing starts again and all the bad comes rushing back. So that's it. That's the latest research on how hormones affect our ADHD symptoms. We have an understanding of how we vary within the month, but this paper also points to other important time periods like puberty, pregnancy, and menopause. This paper has a lot more to say on puberty, and in fact the research underlying a lot of this paper was all the previous studies that the authors did around puberty. But I'm not actually going to go into this now because I work exclusively with adults, so it's not something that's particularly relevant to my clients. But I know adults tend to have kids that go through puberty, so if it is something that's relevant, let me know in the comments and I can come back to this and make another video on it. Otherwise, that's it for today. I'm really looking forward to seeing how this area develops as more research is done. As I said, everything that's been in this video was published in 2024. Leave me a like, comment, hit subscribe if you haven't already, and if you haven't seen it, you might be interested in going back and watching my video on how to train executive function. Thank you for your attention today. I look forward to seeing you in the next one.